What if Christianity didn't begin with divine truth, but with human necessity? What if the stories you were taught to never question were shaped not by revelation, but by pressure, political, cultural, psychological? This video isn't about mocking belief, it's about understanding how belief is built. Because once you see the structure beneath the story, the edits, the contradictions, the motivations, you stop asking, "Is this sacred?" and start asking, "Why did this need to exist?" These are 10 lies Christianity was built on, and more importantly, why they still matter today. Lie number 1, the birthplace that had to fit. You were told Jesus was born in Bethlehem, not because there was strong historical evidence pointing there, but because the story needed to begin in the right place. Long before the Gospels were written, the Hebrew Scriptures had already planted an expectation. The Messiah was supposed to come from Bethlehem, the city of King David. That expectation shaped everything that followed. So when early Christians began telling the story of Jesus, they faced a problem. Jesus was widely known as being from Nazareth. He was called Jesus of Nazareth by followers and critics alike. Nazareth was small, insignificant, and completely absent from messianic prophecy. A Messiah from Nazareth would raise doubts immediately. A Messiah from Bethlehem would feel inevitable. That is where the census enters the story. You were told that Mary and Joseph traveled to Bethlehem because a Roman census required everyone to return to the town of their ancestors. It sounds official, bureaucratic, plausible, but when you look closer, the story collapses. There is no historical record of Rome ever conducting a census this way. None. Roman censuses were practical tools of control. They counted people where they lived, where they owned property, where they could be taxed and monitored. Forcing millions of people to abandon their homes and travel across the empire would have been administrative madness. It would have disrupted agriculture, trade, and taxation, the very things Rome cared about most. Historians know how Roman censuses worked. They know when they happened, they know who ordered them, and no record exists of one matching the gospel account. The silence is not accidental, it is telling. So why invent such a strange scenario? Because without it, Jesus stays in Nazareth, and Nazareth does not fulfill prophecy. The solution was not to question the prophecy. The solution was to bend the story. This is an early example of a pattern that repeats again and again. When reality did not align with expectation, the narrative shifted. Not dramatically, not obviously, just enough to make the pieces fit. And once you allow the birthplace to be rewritten, something important changes. The story stops being anchored to history and starts being guided by necessity. Because if the location of birth can be adjusted to serve prophecy, then lineage, miracles, and meaning can be adjusted too. And that is where everything else begins to unravel. Lie number 2, the bloodline that cancels itself. For the Messiah to be taken seriously, he needed more than miracles. He needed pedigree. Jewish expectation was clear on this point. The Messiah was supposed to come from the royal line of King David. Not symbolically, not spiritually, literally. Blood mattered. Lineage mattered. Without it, the claim fell apart before it even began. So the Gospels provided genealogies, not one, but 2. At first glance, that might seem like reinforcement, more proof, more certainty. But the moment you look closely, the structure collapses. Matthew traces Jesus' ancestry through David's son Solomon, the line of kings. Luke traces it through David's son Nathan, a completely different branch. From that split onward, the names barely overlap. Different fathers, different sons, different generations, 2 family trees that cannot be reconciled without intellectual gymnastics. And yet, both genealogies claim to be describing the same person's lineage. Joseph, that is where the story turns in on itself. Because the same Gospels that work so hard to prove Joseph's royal ancestry also insist that Joseph was not Jesus' biological father. If Jesus was born of a virgin, then Joseph's bloodline is irrelevant. It cannot be inherited. Bloodlines do not transfer through legal proximity. They transfer through biology. If Joseph was not the father, then Jesus inherits nothing from him. Not David's line, not royal legitimacy, nothing. You are forced into an impossible choice. Either Jesus was born of a virgin, in which case the genealogies are meaningless, or Jesus inherited David's bloodline, in which case the virgin birth collapses. You cannot hold both without contradiction. What makes this more revealing is that early Christian writers seemed aware of the tension and simply left it unresolved. The contradiction was not hidden, it was tolerated. Because the story was doing a job, and coherence was secondary to persuasion. The genealogies were not written to preserve history, they were written to satisfy expectation, to answer an unspoken accusation before it was made. How could this man be the Messiah? Look at his lineage. But when you slow down and actually follow the logic, the argument defeats itself. The proof cancels the miracle. The miracle cancels the proof. This is not a small oversight, it is a structural fracture, one that reveals how early Christianity was already balancing competing claims, choosing what felt powerful over what made sense. And if the foundation of Jesus' identity cannot be logically held together, it raises an unsettling question. What other contradictions were allowed to stand simply because they served the larger story? Lie number 3. The virgin birth that started as a word. The virgin birth feels untouchable. It sits at the emotional center of the story, presented not just as a miracle, but as proof of divine origin. Question it, and the entire structure seems to tremble. But when you trace this idea back to its source, you do not find biology or eyewitness testimony. You find a word, and a decision made by translators centuries after the fact. In the Hebrew book of Isaiah, the word used is alma. It simply means a young woman. It does not mean virgin. It does not imply sexual purity. It does not describe a miraculous conception. It is an ordinary word used in ordinary contexts. In its original setting, Isaiah was not predicting a supernatural birth centuries in the future. He was addressing a political situation in his own time. The transformation happens later. When Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, Alma was rendered as Parthenos. That Greek word can mean virgin. It can also mean young woman. But the ambiguity opened the door. A poetic phrase became a biological claim. A metaphor became a miracle. From that single shift, everything changed. A new doctrine formed around it. That doctrine hardened into dogma, and that dogma became identity. The virgin birth was no longer an interpretive possibility. It became a test of faith. To doubt it was to doubt everything. But here is where the story quietly exposes itself. The earliest gospel, Mark, never mentions a virgin birth. Not once. Jesus appears fully formed. No angels, no manger, no miraculous conception. The same silence appears in Paul's letters, written earlier than the Gospels. Paul never describes Jesus as born of a virgin. He never appeals to a miraculous birth to support his theology. If the virgin birth were known, celebrated, and foundational from the beginning, this silence makes no sense. But if the idea had not yet emerged, the silence becomes understandable. The virgin birth appears later, in Matthew and Luke, written decades after Jesus' life. And even then, the stories do not match. Different angels, different reactions, different details. The miracle is not remembered, it is constructed. Once you recognize that this defining belief rests on a translation choice rather than a historical claim, something shifts. The miracle does not disappear, but its authority does. It stops being inevitable and starts looking intentional. And once miracles can be added retroactively to serve theology, history becomes flexible. Meaning replaces memory. Belief replaces evidence. Which leads to a larger question that cannot be avoided. If this miracle emerged from a word, how many others emerged from necessity rather than truth? Lie number 4. The man history never met. Jesus is presented as a public figure operating in full view of society. A miracle worker who healed the sick openly. A teacher who gathered crowds. A disruptor who challenged religious authorities and overturned tables in the temple. These are not quiet acts done in isolation. They are the kind of actions that normally attract attention, scrutiny, and records. And yet, when we step outside Christian writings and look at the historical landscape of the first century, we find something unsettling. There is no contemporary record of Jesus during his lifetime. No Roman historian mentions him while he was alive. No Jewish court documents record his trial. No administrative notes, no letters, no official reports. This silence is not due to poor record-keeping. Rome was meticulous. Judea was heavily monitored. We have documentation of minor rebels who failed, obscure prophets who drew small followings, and local uprisings that barely disturbed the empire. We even have records of tax disputes and property conflicts involving ordinary citizens. But not this man. This does not automatically mean Jesus never existed. Silence alone cannot erase a person from history, but it does expose something else. It reveals how dramatically the story has grown in hindsight. The louder the claims become, the more noticeable the absence of confirmation feels. When someone is said to have healed the blind in public, fed thousands, and raised the dead, you expect at least a ripple outside a single tradition. When that ripple never appears, questions are unavoidable. The earliest non-Christian references to Jesus appeared decades later, and even those are brief, second-hand, and debated by scholars. They do not confirm miracles, they do not describe a public ministry, they simply acknowledge that a movement existed and that its followers believed certain things. What we are left with is a widening gap between the magnitude of the claims and the thinness of the evidence. That gap tells a story of its own. And when stories grow louder over time, while evidence remains silent, something else is happening. Memory is being shaped. Meaning is being layered. Theology is filling the space where documentation should be. This pattern becomes even more troubling when you notice that the miracles increase the further you move from the events themselves. The earliest accounts are restrained, the later ones are dramatic. The silence does not break, it is overwritten. Which raises a sobering possibility. The Jesus of history may have been far quieter than the Jesus of theology. And once that difference appears, it becomes harder to tell where the man ends and the message begins. Lie number 5. The eyewitnesses who weren't there. Most people grow up believing the Gospels were written by men who walked beside Jesus. That Matthew was there listening, that John remembered every word, that these were first-hand memories, carefully preserved. But that assumption does not come from the texts themselves. It comes from tradition added later. The Gospels are anonymous. None of them identify their author in the original manuscripts. No signatures, no introductions, no claims of eyewitness status. The familiar names were attached decades later by church leaders trying to organize and legitimize a growing body of writings. On this point, there is rare agreement across scholarship. Conservative scholars, secular historians, even Christian theologians acknowledge that the Gospels were written long after the events they describe, roughly 40 to 70 years later. That is not a short delay. That is 2 full generations. In that kind of gap, stories do not remain static. They pass from mouth to mouth. They are retold in different communities. They absorb emphasis. They lose detail. They gain meaning. This is not dishonesty. It is how human memory works. Mark, the earliest gospel, presents a restrained Jesus, emotional, confused at times, afraid at death, a man chosen by God, but still clearly human. There is no birth story, no cosmic pre-existence, no speeches about being one with the Father. John, written much later, presents a very different figure. This Jesus speaks like a divine being. He claims eternal existence. He delivers long theological monologues. He is less a teacher and more a symbol made flesh. These are not minor stylistic differences. They represent an evolution in how Jesus is understood. The same figure moves from prophet to pre-existent logos, from human messenger to cosmic entity. That shift is not what eyewitness memory looks like. Eyewitnesses disagree on details, not on identity. They do not transform a person's nature over time. That kind of transformation belongs to mythology. As the story spread, it needed reinforcement, authority, structure, a sense that this version was the original one. Even though it came later, attaching names to the texts helped. Saying they came from eyewitnesses helped even more. Once the story gained sacred status, questioning authorship became dangerous, because if the witnesses were not there, then the certainty dissolves, and belief built on uncertainty needs protection. That protection did not come from evidence. It came from tradition repeating itself until repetition felt like truth. And when a belief depends on assuming witnesses who were never present, the story becomes less about what happened and more about what needed to be believed. Lie number 6. The 500 witnesses no one can name. At first glance, this claim feels overwhelming. Paul writes that more than 500 people saw the risen Jesus at the same time. Not one or two, not a small group of devoted followers. 500. It sounds like the kind of number meant to end all doubt. But the moment you slow down, the certainty dissolves. Who were these people? Where did this event take place? When did it happen? Paul gives no names, no locations, no details that could be checked even in his own time. There are no letters from these witnesses, no independent testimonies, no follow-up accounts, not even a single quoted voice from the crowd. What makes this more striking is that the Gospels written later never mention this event at all. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John describe resurrection appearances. Some are private. Some are small group encounters. None of them include a moment where hundreds of people see Jesus together. A mass appearance of that scale would have been impossible to forget. It would have been the strongest piece of evidence available, and yet it disappears completely. A crowd that large should leave a trail. Someone writes something. Someone argues about it. Someone denies it. But outside of Paul's single sentence, there is nothing. This is not how historical events behave. This is how rhetorical claims behave. Numbers get bigger when certainty is needed. Authority speaks in broad strokes when detail would weaken the message. Paul himself never met Jesus during his lifetime. His understanding of Jesus came through visions and revelation. That does not automatically discredit him, but it does explain the nature of his claims. He is not reporting what he saw. He is asserting what he believes others experienced. And belief, when repeated confidently, can sound like fact. A claim without names is not evidence. It is persuasion. It asks you to trust the speaker, not the story. And once authority becomes the foundation, proof becomes unnecessary. This moment matters because it reveals a shift. The story is no longer grounded in memory or testimony. It is grounded in confidence, in the expectation that repetition will do the work evidence cannot. And that shift sets the stage for the central claim of the entire religion. Because when belief no longer requires witnesses, it can grow far beyond what history can support. Which brings us to the centerpiece. Number 7. The resurrection that kept changing. The resurrection is not a side detail. It is the hinge everything turns on. Without it, Christianity loses its authority, its promise of salvation, its claim to divine victory over death. Paul himself admits this when he says that if the resurrection did not happen, the faith is meaningless. That makes this story the most important one to get right. And yet, it is the one that refuses to stay still. The earliest gospel, Mark, ends in an unsettling way. The women go to the tomb, they find it empty, they are frightened, and they tell no one. There is no risen Jesus, no triumphant appearance, no reassurance, just fear and silence. That is where the story originally stops. For a moment, sit with that. The oldest account of the resurrection ends without a resurrection appearance at all. Later manuscripts add an ending to Mark. Scholars agree on this. Verses were appended to give closure, to include appearances, to make the story align with what believers had come to expect. The silence was no longer acceptable. The story needed resolution. Then come the other Gospels, each adding their own layer. Matthew introduces guards at the tomb, as if anticipating skepticism and trying to preempt it. Luke adds a long, emotional journey where Jesus explains Scripture along the way. John goes further, offering physical proof. Touch the wounds. Put your hand here. Do not doubt. Different witnesses, different settings, different words spoken by Jesus after rising. Even the timing shifts. Who arrives at the tomb first? How many angels are present? What they say? Who Jesus appears to, and when? One event should anchor a narrative. This one drifts. In history, the closer you are to an event, the clearer it tends to be. In this case, the opposite happens. The earliest version is sparse and ambiguous. The later versions are detailed and confident. That is not how memory works. That is how belief evolves. The resurrection story did not stabilize because it was remembered. It stabilized because it was needed. Communities struggling with doubt required certainty. Leaders required authority. The story expanded to meet those needs. This does not look like eyewitness preservation. It looks like theological reinforcement. Each retelling smooths over uncertainty, fills in gaps, and answers objections that only arose later. The resurrection becomes less about what happened and more about what must be believed, not because the truth was clear, but because the faith could not survive without it. And once belief depends on a story that keeps changing, the question shifts from, did this happen, to why did it need to be told this way? That question leads directly to the next problem. Because if the resurrection story evolved, then so did the events surrounding the death itself. Lie number 8. The crucifixion that can't agree with itself. You would expect the death of Jesus to be the most stable part of the story. Executions are public, brutal, hard to forget. If anything should be remembered clearly, it should be the moment everything ended. And yet, the crucifixion is one of the most inconsistent narratives in the Gospels. The day itself changes. In some accounts, Jesus is crucified on Passover. In another, he is crucified the day before. That is not a small detail. Passover is the central Jewish festival. Moving the execution changes the entire theological meaning. One version presents Jesus as sharing the meal. Another turns him into the sacrificial lamb killed before it begins. The final words change too. In Mark, Jesus cries out in despair, asking why God has abandoned him. It is raw, human, broken. In Luke, Jesus is calm and forgiving, speaking words of mercy. In John, he is composed and in control, declaring that everything is finished. These are not variations of memory. They are entirely different emotional portraits. The behavior on the cross shifts as well. In one version, Jesus is mocked and helpless. In another, he speaks with authority and intention. Even the thieves crucified beside him behave differently depending on the gospel. Sometimes both mock him, sometimes one repents and is promised paradise. So which version is true? The uncomfortable answer is that each version served a different purpose. Mark writes to emphasize suffering and abandonment. Luke emphasizes compassion and forgiveness. John emphasizes divinity and control. The cross becomes a canvas, not a record. These are not reporting differences like conflicting eyewitness angles. They are ideological differences. Each author reshapes the death to teach a lesson their community needed to hear. The crucifixion stops being an event and becomes a message. That is how symbols work. They are flexible. They adapt to emotion. They are rewritten to guide how people feel, what they fear, and what they accept. The cross becomes a tool for meaning, not memory. But symbols alone do not build institutions. They prepare people to accept authority, but they do not enforce it. For that, something else is required: power. Once the story of the cross could be shaped at will, it became useful. Useful to inspire obedience. Useful to justify suffering. Useful to frame sacrifice as virtue. And once that framing was accepted, it could be scaled. The crucifixion narrative does not collapse because it is inconsistent. It succeeds because it is adaptable. Each version speaks to a different emotional need. And when a story can change without breaking belief, it becomes strong enough to carry something much larger. That is when theology stops being about truth and starts becoming infrastructure. And that is where the story moves next. Lie number 9. The martyrs who appeared later. You were told that the earliest Christians died willingly for what they knew was true, that they faced lions, fire, and execution with unshakable certainty. The image is powerful. Ordinary people choosing death rather than denying what they had seen. For many believers, this is treated as the final proof. After all, who would die for a lie? But when you look for these stories in the historical record, something unsettling appears. Or rather, something does not appear at all. Most of the famous martyrdom accounts emerge generations after the events they describe, not during the lives of the apostles, not in contemporary Roman records, not in Jewish court documents. They surface later in church writings, sermons, and devotional texts shaped by theology, not documentation. There are no verified, detailed records describing Peter's upside-down crucifixion during his lifetime. No contemporary account of Paul's execution. No official Roman lists of mass Christian executions in arenas during the earliest period. What we find instead are legendary retellings that grow more dramatic with time. This does not mean Christians were never persecuted. They were. But persecution was sporadic, localized, and often political rather than religious. Early Christian communities frequently lived quietly alongside pagan neighbors. Some even avoided attention altogether. So why did martyrdom become central to the story? Because persecution narratives are powerful. They bind people together. They turn belief into identity. Once suffering is framed as proof of truth, doubt becomes betrayal. Questioning becomes moral failure. Leaving becomes dishonoring the dead. Martyrdom stories do emotional work. They make belief feel noble. They discourage examination. They replace evidence with sacrifice. You are no longer asked to evaluate claims. You are asked to honor suffering. But dying for a belief does not make it true. People have died for false beliefs throughout history. They have died for political ideologies, cult leaders, and imagined promises. Sincerity is not evidence. Conviction is not confirmation. What matters is who benefits from the story of sacrifice. When martyrdom is emphasized, authority gains insulation. Leaders can say this faith cost lives. Who are you to question it? The past becomes a weapon against the present. Loyalty is demanded not because the story is solid, but because it is sacred. And once belief is protected by emotional debt, it becomes very difficult to challenge. The story no longer stands on what happened, it stands on what people are told to others endured. This is how movements harden into institutions, not through truth alone, but through narratives that punish doubt and glorify obedience. And once that structure is in place, the final transformation becomes possible, the one that locked belief into power and made it untouchable. And finally, we arrive at the lie that sealed everything in place. Lie number 10. The religion that won by force. Christianity is often described as a message so compelling that it conquered the ancient world through truth alone. A faith that spread because people recognized something divine in it. But history tells a far less romantic story. Christianity did not rise to power because it convinced the Roman Empire. It rose because the Roman Empire chose it. By the early 4th century, Rome was fractured. Civil wars, rival emperors, regional loyalties, and religious fragmentation were tearing the empire apart. The old gods no longer unified people. There were too many of them, too many cults, too many competing loyalties. Constantine did not need a revelation, he needed cohesion. Christianity offered exactly that. One God, one moral framework, one expanding network of bishops already used to hierarchy and obedience. When Constantine aligned himself with Christianity, the faith gained something it had never had before: state backing. From that moment on, belief was no longer optional in the same way. Doctrine had to be standardized. Disagreement became dangerous. Councils were called not to discover truth, but to enforce uniformity. Texts were selected. Others were rejected, labeled heretical, and suppressed. Alternative versions of Jesus were erased, not because they were disproven, but because they threatened unity. Church and state merged. Bishops gained political power. Emperors gained divine legitimacy. Questioning belief was no longer just a personal matter. It became a challenge to authority itself. This is the point where Christianity stops being a movement of marginal voices and becomes an institution. Institutions do not survive on truth alone. They survive on control, repetition, and enforcement. The faith that once claimed persecution now wielded it. Pagan temples were converted or destroyed. Dissenters were silenced. Orthodoxy was enforced with law. The story of Jesus was no longer allowed to evolve freely. It was frozen into an approved version. Not because it was historically perfect, but because it was politically useful. From here on, Christianity spread alongside armies, laws, and imperial borders. Conversion was encouraged, resistance was punished. The message of love was wrapped in authority. The symbol of the cross marched with power. This does not mean belief was insincere. Many people truly believed, but sincerity is not the same as origin. What matters is how the religion achieved dominance. Christianity did not win because it was tested and proven. It won because it was chosen, enforced, and protected by the most powerful empire of its time. From that moment forward, the faith was no longer preserved by truth. It was preserved by control. So, why does any of this still matter? Because stories do not stay in the past. They shape how people think, how they obey, how they fear, and how they judge themselves and others. When a belief system is built on authority instead of evidence, it quietly trains the mind to submit rather than explore. It rewards certainty and punishes curiosity. This is not about stripping life of meaning or replacing faith with emptiness. It is about replacing fear with clarity. It is about realizing that truth does not need protection. It does not collapse when examined. Only myths demand silence. If this made you uncomfortable, that reaction matters. Discomfort is often the first sign that something long accepted is finally being seen clearly. It is the sound of thinking returning after a long pause. So keep questioning, keep reading, keep pulling at the threads, even when the answers feel unsettling, especially then. And if you value truth over tradition, clarity over comfort, and understanding over obedience, subscribe. Because the most dangerous lies are not the ones shouted loudly, but the ones we are taught to never examine.